So this is part 2 then, Colin, of our little chats about your book and actually what it relates to in the real world around us, because that's really important, because that's not why you wrote the book, right? You didn't write the book just to keep it on the pages there. You wanted it to become real, right?
Well, it started as real and then ended up as a book. So I've been obviously reading the story of Abraham since I was maybe 9 years old. Became a Christian at 11, but I started reading the Bible a bit before that. And it's always fascinated me, and it's always struck me as so real. And that's why I wrote it. So it went from reality, if you like, to a novel in order to bring reality to people's lives. It's wonderful.
Yeah, so we've had the Tower of Babel, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Then we're now following the line of Shem, okay,
Mm-hmm.
which Terah is a part of that. And what do we know about Terah himself?
Here's the thing, actually, Simon. We know very little about any of these characters. They lived, 4,000 years ago plus. And I love going to the British Museum or something. You see these statues that says 2000 BC or 2500 BC, and something resonates in my heart saying, good grief, Abraham was alive in those days. But we know very, very little about these guys. We know very little about Terah. So it was quite fascinating writing the book, because Terah suddenly decides to get up and go home. And no one knows why, except that a few years later he's dead. So you sort of piece, it's a bit like sort of doing forensics. You sort of piece it together. Did he go home to die? Why would he leave her? Why would he leave such a stunning, sophisticated place to go to a backwater like Haran? Unless it was to go home, because it's where he was from, we do know that much, to die. So you have to piece this stuff together, and a lot of it's conjecture. And as long as you realize it's conjecture, that's fine, as long as you don't start claiming too much for it.
Yeah, totally. Culturally, then, how important is it to die where you were born, or to go back to the place where you are then?
Again, I don't want to be definitive about this, but here's what I do believe. I actually believe there's so much more similarities between cultures and generations than we give it credit for. Yeah, I've done quite a lot of travel. I've been to about 75 nations around the world, lived in homes in most of them. So I've really engaged with different cultures. And what you discover is people are people are people are people. And I've sat in the most outrageous places and just felt an affinity with the person that I'm trying to communicate with. And I think that's not just true cross-culturally, it's true cross-generationally. So I honestly believe that what was going on here was that Terah, as he reached old age, he'd achieved a lot in his life. He was a very successful trader. We do know that. So he'd achieved a lot, but then he's sitting there facing death. And all the insecurities you and I feel when we come to that place of our mortality, they are just as real for a man like Terah. So what does he do? I think he does what we all do. Nostalgia kicks in. We think of those beautiful times in childhood, when we played in the park, or all that sort of stuff. And you say, I just want to go back. If I'm going to die, I want to go back to where it all began and go full circle. It's the circle of life, as Elton John would say.
Why on earth then did people go to Eastbourne to die? I mean, I don't understand. I've never understood.
Well, boys, there are some exceptions to the rule.
Because surely, you're right. There is something quite about that smell, isn't it? Or finding a sweet shop that sells sweets when you were younger. Do you know what I mean? That kind of taste and feel of, that revisiting of a museum, like you say, that kind of gives you that contexture of like, oh man, I like these. And why do we love these programs on TV that goes back to the 70s shop or the 80s shop or whatever?
I know.
We love those, don't we? Like revisiting some of those things there. So, I mean, Abraham grew up in a huge family, right? It wasn't just him. I mean, sometimes we can misread what the Bible says and not realize actually how many brothers and sisters Abraham had.
Yeah, it's very complicated because it's evident that Terah was married a couple of times, had various kids. Some kids died, and therefore they had to marry. Culturally they had to marry the widow, and it was all very, very complicated. You think your family's messed up or my family's messed up, Simon? have a look at Abraham's family, which is why, of course, he was able to call Sarah his sister and not be lying. She was his sort of half sister. So it was a complex family, but family meant so much, as again, culturally through generations it does, which of course was Abraham's problem, because he was childless and lacked that legacy. And if Terah was heading back to Haran to die, Abraham was heading to Haran to find life. I think he was actually looking for purpose and meaning, and was looking for that in God, and God had told him to go to Canaan ultimately, but he stops off in Haran for 5 years or so.
Yeah, no, totally. And Canaan's quite a big player in the Bible, right? Isn't it? Just that kind of has that big effect. There's a long term what God is doing around that particular area, which I find incredibly fascinating, even for today, right? But back then again, you've got, so Abraham goes with dad. He's got his sisters, his wives, and so on and so forth. Do you think he was just being loyal to dad? I mean, did he just go because of dad, or actually was there a bigger motive that was going on there for him, do you think?
Well, it's complicated again. Sorry to keep repeating myself, because Abraham had obviously had a call from God, which, we need to chat about, actually, because that's pretty dramatic, isn't it? And God had told him to leave his family, leave his home. Instead of that, he compromises and ends up going with his family. So that's quite an interesting one. So family was important, but actually he was told to leave his family and go to Canaan. He ended up going with his family to Haran. So there's a subplot there somewhere.
Let's dive in a bit. The first question is, how on earth was the big question is, Abraham was in the right place at the right time to hear God.
Yeah.
So how do we find ourselves? Because surely Abraham spent his whole life, and he wasn't a young man when God called him. No. So 75 years of his life, he's been waiting, and probably would he expected to hear God, do you think? I mean,
No, I don't think he would have done, Simon, because that generation had really lost sight of God. If you look through the genealogies, there's this great tradition and history, but it was probably his grandmother. He probably heard tales of God told by his grandmother, maybe, which is why it really fascinates me, Simon, because here's a guy in search of the unknown. He there's a sense in his spirit that there is a God, but he has no idea what he's like, and therefore he has no idea what he sounds like. He's no idea how to hear him. He's no idea if he has heard him when he starts to speak. There's all these sorts of, and that's why I just love Abraham, because you're right. God was able to speak to him, and there's something in that I've wrestled with, because that's what I want to know. I want to be the sort of person who can truly know God. So how do I get into the right place? You've summed up the question perfectly. How do you get into the right place to hear from God? And I think there are a few things going for Abraham at this point. One of them we've hit was that there was an emptiness in his life. The one thing that mattered was having kids, and he didn't have them. He had everything else. If he could find meaning in a good marriage, in wealth, in the respect of the community, etc., sophistication, he had was full of the arts and all the fineries of life. I mean, he had everything. And yet there's this hole when it comes to that what really mattered was your legacy was found in your kids, and he had no kids. So there was this big aching hole. There was this felt need, I suppose is the way I put it. And that's a lot of our problem, is that we don't have this felt need. It's so funny, because we know there's an emptiness, we know there's a superficiality, and yet we still keep chasing after the wind. We refuse to stop, and this fascinates me because I don't know why we do this. We refuse to stop and ask the hard questions. I think Abraham asked the hard questions, and that is why he got the real answers. But it didn't happen immediately. And that's the second thing I'd say about Abraham. He was amazingly persistent, because you follow through God as God speaks to him, and it seems to start with a whisper and then ends up with God actually appearing to him. And yet that happens over decades. I mean, it's not an immediate thing. And yet Abraham doesn't give up, and that's our other problem. We live on such an instant world that not only do we not ask the right questions, we can't be bothered to hang around to get the answers. So put the two together, and we're stuffed basically. But Abraham,
I was going to say, because that is the 21st century problem. And the fact that there's a couple of things. Let's pick up on what you just said. Well, the fact that to stop and to ask the right questions, and not just to ask the right questions, because actually we don't know what the right question is, but to ask a question, or to keep on asking a question. And I think that's very, very important. I think to stop and be able to do that, and without fear, right? Because I sometimes wonder, if I say something, I'm going to be like, oh, shouldn't have said that, whatever. But I want to find myself in a position where I'm actually asking all the questions all the time. Do you mean that kind of childlike faith that actually that says, oh Lord, what about this? What about my painting? How can I make this a bit, and involve him in much more, so that I can then be attentive to hearing? Because you're right, because there's a point where the second thing you said about hearing his voice over time, I mean, he's having a blooming conversation. We'll go to Sodom and Gomorrah at some point, but he has an actual conversation that results on, like, well, if there was a few less people, do you know what I mean?
Yes,
we'll go there, not today, because we want to highlight some of these things that God has spoken to him about. But you're right. How do we have the discipline, though, to stop? Because how many times have you said, man, you need to stop every morning, read your Bible and do that? And people are living in an instant world where it's just a flick of a screen, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I suppose I count myself fortunate, blessed, I don't know what, not to be brought up in this generation, because I get all the benefits of it, but I build upon the foundation of my generation, which actually you basically had to work at stuff. It wasn't chucked at you. When I studied law back in the day, I didn't have a computer. I had to go to the library and get all these books off the shelf and this sort of stuff. And as a kid, the same was true. And of course, that's now equipped me to live in an instant world, but I still have a foundation upon which to build, which is one of dogged perseverance, I suppose, at the end of the day, because that's what life was like. Now, my parents were even more. They were the post-war generation, or the war generation, and I mean, if they saw a banana, they got very excited. And and there's a joy to that, because that discipline is actually, I think, so significant in hearing from God. I think it's a few things. I think discipline is the big underrated necessity, that you're just gonna. I love the Greeks that went to Jesus, and the disciples said, "What do you want?" And they said, "We would see Jesus." You can imagine them saying it with a sort of bit of attitude, they were gonna see Jesus, and they're not asking the question. We're going to say, "We would see Jesus," and that was it. That was all they were interested in doing, and there was that stubborn, dogged determination, which held them in that place. Secondly, though, I think there's this honesty, and I think that is what God responds to. So, and you see this all the way through the Bible. You see it in Abraham. Were you really, God? Honestly, are you really going to destroy this city? You see it in David, who sort of cries out to God so many times. Why do the righteous perish and the wicked prosper? You see it in Jeremiah. I love that. I am deceived and you have deceived me. That's one of my favorite Bible verses, because how many of us can relate to that? But that attitude of facing up with all due respect to the holiness of God, saying, "God, I don't get this. I don't understand this. I don't even know whether you're there or not, to be honest with you right now." I think the Lord can't resist that sort of challenge, actually, and That's what he responds to.
So,
And that's, I
so
think that's what Abraham had. Born out of desperation,
okay.
born through perseverance, and expressed in that dogged determination.
But what would he have understood by the words, I'll make you into a great nation, I will bless you, I will make your name great, and you'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, I'll curse you, those whoever you curses you, I will curse all the peoples on earth blessed through you. What on earth would he have understood by that then? Because that's like that first step, isn't it? That kind of understanding, surely.
Yeah, Simon, you're asking some great questions. You're quite good at this, aren't you? But I mean, honestly, I'm not sure he had a clue. I mean, here's a guy, right? He's got no kids. He's going to die. He's going to be buried. No one's going to remember him. And then suddenly God doesn't just show up, doesn't just begin to answer his prayer, but makes these outrageous statements like, "You're not just going to have a kid or two. You're going to be a great nation." And I think Abraham, well, he might have filed it for future reference, but it may have just gone straight over his head, to be honest. There are a few occasions where this happens in the story, where God says something, and you sort of pick up by Abraham's response, he hasn't really understood what God was saying, which again is why I love it, because it's so real. Because he says, your descendants are going to be destroyed. And he goes, oh, I'm going to have descendants. That's good news, isn't it?
Yes. I love that.
You think, no, go to the end of the sentence.
Yes. Oh no, well, that gives us a little bit of hope, surely. That actually, I wonder sometimes maybe if when I've heard God, and if I've even heard God when He said something that I've heard it correctly. Do you know what I mean? Then rather than just kind of misheard, and then gone on 40 steps before I'd even heard the bit, or just heard the bit I wanted to hear, rather than not. Because I know that a couple of chapters later, God does repeat again to him, do you know what, I'm going to make your descendants great. And so I think that's what I like about God as well, in the sense of he doesn't just say it once, he just keeps on saying it. There must be an occasion in your life then, Colin, when God has said something to you, but actually then repeated it maybe in a different way, or in a different shape, or a different design, or...
So I keep a journal, and I do it for a number of reasons. I've kept it for about 20 years now. One of the main reasons is I like to look back on that day, however many years ago, and I want to compare what is God saying now to what was he saying then. And it's very humbling when it's the same thing, because you realize you haven't been listening. And if God is having to repeat himself with the same stuff and you still haven't learned the lesson, it's pretty humbling. And that's one of the reasons I keep a journal, because it keeps me on my toes to work out what, am I learning anything, or am I just going around the block? And I think with most of us, certainly with me, God has to go around the block again and again and again and again, and yet he still loves us. And we see it in Abraham. God says the same again and again and again and again. And it takes Abraham, and I don't hold this against Abraham, because I so get it. God says you're going to have a child, and he looks at Sarah and thinks, I love my wife, but really?
Well, come on, spot spoiler here. We're a plot spoiler here. We'll do that in a few weeks, all right? But yeah, no, you're right though. It's there's a moment where I don't mind, but I do mind hearing the same thing again and again, because actually I don't want to become deaf to hearing the same thing again and again. I don't want to be so closed off and not hearing God keeps saying the same thing to me. I don't want to ever be in that position, because I mean, at Church of the Week, they said something and I went, I've even preached on that, and I'm hearing it and I'm going, I really need to kind of make sure that those are the things that I'm doing again and again and again. So there's some things that are repeatable, but there's some things that are quite specific, aren't they, when God speaks into our lives, really. So number one, we need to be in the right place, and the right place being just being open and just asking questions, I suppose, right, Colin?
Yeah, absolutely. Being honest, being open, and being and persevering.
And don't worry about what God has said. You may not understand it, but maybe, like Colin, write a journal and God will piece that together, surely, over time.
Absolutely, Simon. God doesn't tease us. He doesn't pour stuff out. In fact, a lot of the time, I think that's why he doesn't seem to answer us, is because we simply wouldn't get it if he tried. And God knows that. So he's very he certainly knows that with me anyway. He's very gentle, very patient.
And that is a good place to be, and having surrounding yourself like Abraham had with family was still important to him. Do you know what I mean? Wasn't it at the time as well? So
I mean, at the end of the day, he still took Lot with him into Canaan. He was supposed to have left the whole family behind, and he just felt responsible for this lad and took him with him. And because again, that's his nephew, and so his dad had died, and so I mean, family's complicated, and family's important, and Abraham, took that responsibility seriously. Yeah.
Well, we'll next time we will talk about jealousy and about how the jealousy of the animals and the flocks and everything else like this, and quarreling, and how we deal with issues that have long-term effects, certainly with our own lives, and how it can have a knock-on effect with our relationship with God as well. So we'll do this again, right?
I'd love to, Simon. Thanks so much.